So this is our second session, and this session is titled Future Initiatives. And the next one after the Future Initiatives will be our last session, which is the third one, and we'll have a panel discussion. But what is really important for us is this session is going to be a forward-looking session. Basically, at the heart of it is the focus on Africa's own agency, how Africa can use its own potential, do things, take initiatives, and move all this energy. So at least there's something that's done about all these great potential and opportunities. So I look forward to listening to our next three speakers. And can I ask them to join us on the panel? There are three of them. The first one is Miss Nakubiana Mugomba. Where is she? Yes, on the other side. And then we have Mr. Akabondo Kabechani. And our third one is Ms. Shaida Napomba. Can you please join us on the podium here? And so while they're coming, let me quickly give you a short sense of who they are, what they've done, at least the top of the pyramid we know about. Our first speaker is Nakumbia Mugomba, who works at the Zambian Institute for Policy Analysis and Research as a macroeconomist, and she also worked at the international development at the African Development Bank. She also did some work at the Overseas Development Institute, where she was a fellow at the Central Bank of Solomon Islands. There, she was an Australian government-funded interim policy advisor at the Ministry of Finance and Treasury. And at the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, her research interests are basically around a couple of things. The first one is the China Belt and Road Initiatives, Zambia's relations with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, as well as she spent some time as a researcher in transport and infrastructure development. Our second speaker in this session, Mr. Akabondo Kabechani, whom you saw yesterday, but he's back with us again, trying to give us a lot more insight and foresight. He has a vast experience in energy policy reform and research at the Policy Monitoring and Research Center, which is a public policy and research think tank based in Lusaka, Zambia. His research area, at least areas include 1, energy reform lessons and implementation, learning from international experience in electricity tariffs reform, energy policy reform, the impact of removal of electricity subsidies on small, medium-sized enterprises and poor households. 3rd, the welfare effects of unprecedented electricity price hikes in Zambia. 4th, energy policy reform, independent power producers and power sector reform. And 5th, energy roadmap delivery, Zambia's energy needs. As a published researcher and a graduate of the University of the Witwatersrand, the University of Zambia, an MBA candidate focusing on Zambia's state power sector company reforms. He's also a member of the steering committee on Zambia's cost of service studies being run by the Ministry of Energy and Energy Regulation Board in Zambia to assess the cost of providing electricity in Zambia. This is very long, and I think this panel is probably going to have a lot to share with us. And our third guest is Shaida Napomba, who is a general manager at Lehigh Shem Industrial Park, where she specializes in facilitation to investors with a great interest towards China. Is that correct? Okay. Can I ask our first speaker to join us? And she is Nakubiana Mungomba. Please give her a good hand of applause.
All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen and hosts, for having me here. I've only got 15 minutes, so let me zoom through this. I'm going to be speaking on regional infrastructure imperatives for the AfCFTA, that's Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and the development of Southern Africa in particular. This is based on a paper that is yet to be written, and I'm conducting the research with two of my colleagues from Zipper as well, Ms. Mwanda Puri and Mrs. Malindi Chatora. Okay, so firstly, you would have heard a few of the speakers mention the CFTA earlier, and just a brief overview of what it is essentially a flagship project of the African Union, Agenda 2063, which the theme of which is the Africa we want. And it was essentially, Africa resolved to establish it in about 2012. It has a few core objectives, including to deepen economic integration among the 55 African countries, to create a unified market for goods and services estimated at 1.2 billion people, probably more, and this will leverage on a collective GDP of more than $3.4 trillion. The CFTA also aims to act as a catalyst for unblocking Africa's manufacturing potential and stimulating the structural transformation process. Essentially, as a few other speakers have also mentioned, industrialization remains a key development agenda for Africa. So the CFTA is sort of trying to boost that on the continent, and in particular boost intra-Africa trade, which remains very low at about 12% that we are trading within the continent as opposed to trading externally. So what I'm going to do, or what we intend to do in our research, is to see what aspects of the CFTA need to be, what imperatives there are that need to be put in place in order to make the CFTA a success. And as regards infrastructure development in particular, given the theme of this conference and the book, we are thinking that there will be a need to look at transport infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, and energy infrastructure in order to make the CFTA a success. Okay, so the CFTA was in 2018, the Kigali Declaration was signed, and the CFTA presents considerable economic potential that needs to be tapped into. Not all of the countries have ratified as of yet, but it's still a work in process, and all of the countries are still trying to figure out what they're going to get from it and whether it suits their needs. But essentially, the CFTA is a necessary but insufficient condition to boost intra-Africa trade. So one of the aims, or one of the methods that it intends on boosting intra-Africa trade, is to eliminate tariffs within the continent. But we are essentially saying that there are other fundamentals that need to be put in place. And these are the three that I mentioned a little earlier. That is ICT, energy, and transport infrastructure. I'll get into more detail on those a little later, so I won't dwell on them now. But we have heard, so we're talking about the CFTA, and then we're talking about infrastructure, and then the third piece of this story, I suppose, is China. Where does that fit in? We've already heard statistics being mentioned about how the AfDB estimates the infrastructure financing needs of the continent, but they also say that the financing gap that actually exists is anywhere between 68 to 108 billion US dollars. So this isn't a space that we believe China can come into to help with plugging that financing gap. Obviously, as the ambassador mentioned yesterday, China is not made entirely of money. Therefore, they're not going to be able to finance that entire gap, but they can go some way in aiding Africa to boost their infrastructure potential. Okay, very quickly, the CFTA is essentially about regional integration. And we've been asked to look specifically at Southern Africa. And what we're saying is that once the CFTA is fully put in place, it will be the largest single trading bloc in the world by number of country members. And this means that it holds great potential for deepening regional integration, transforming economies, and stimulating industrial development. And simulations of the impact of the CFTA suggest that intra-Africa trade and real income and wage predictions will be boosted by the implementation of the CFTA. And this will increase overall real income, thereby increasing standard of living across the continent, boosting intra-Africa trade, as well as boosting industrial and agricultural exports. So the last session was talking about agricultural production, and the CFTA will go some way in helping that. Essentially, from the graph which is up there on the screen is just showing the regional economic communities that sort of overlap in Southern Africa. So we've got SACU, Southern Africa, oh my gosh, it slips my mind. Anyway, and then we've got SADC and we've got COMESA. And as you can see, they're considerably smaller than what the potential that the CFTA will provide once it is set up. So where does China come in? Here we're essentially saying that there is intersections between what the CFTA wishes to achieve, in particular, since it comes under the Agenda 2063 of the AU. And then there's intersections between that and the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, well, it started off essentially being about infrastructure development across the globe. Mr. Salim showed us a map earlier which showed that Africa was not in fact a big player in the original plan of the BRI, but today over 72% of the members of the AU are actually signed up. I think the ambassador yesterday said that 44 countries on the African continent are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's overlap there, and then of course there's the FOCAC, which has been the main sort of medium of interaction between Africa and China since about 2000. And the pledges that they've made. And in 2018, they essentially put forward, eight initiatives were put forward on how the cooperation between China and Africa would be enhanced. And one of those spoke very specifically to the CFTA and said that they are all about supporting the CFTA, boosting the level of trades between Africa and China, but not just boosting volumes, but also the quality of trade. So they're not just looking to continue to import sort of raw materials from Africa, but also increasing the value added and the quality of imports, or exports rather, from Africa to China. I will skip that. And looking at infrastructure commitment trends in Africa, we see that, well, firstly, I'm going to say that we have had some issues finding adequate data on some of these topics, but essentially there's a report produced by Infrastructure Financing Trends in Africa, and this was from 2017. And from the graph, which you can see up there, I don't know how clear it is, it's a bit fuzzy, but if you pay attention to sort of the gray bar there, that is the amount of financing that China has contributed towards infrastructure commitments in Africa. It ebbs and flows, but for the most part, over the 5 years up to 2007, China has been the third largest financer of total infrastructure commitments and the single largest bilateral financer. And this is according to the Infrastructure Financing Trends Report. In Southern Africa, again, it's a bit more difficult to get data that is disaggregated to that level. But just looking at the SADC region, looking at the Southern African region, there's another report by the Deloitte Africa Construction Trends Report. And that essentially tracks large construction projects with the value of over $50 million that are going on at, I think it's 1st June of any given year. So these values I'm about to quote are from 2018. And essentially China funded 21.4% of the 103 projects that were taking place at the time at a value of $125 billion. Skip that one. Okay, so getting into the sort of infrastructure imperatives that I mentioned earlier. In terms of transport, I think it's been mentioned several times already that the transport infrastructure on the continent is fairly inadequate. And this creates challenges in intra-Africa trade in terms of us being able to take the goods that we do produce to other countries within the continent. What we are finding is that, of course, China has invested heavily in infrastructure development, particularly in transport infrastructure on the continent, and we're essentially saying that there is greater scope for this. I think as Mr. Kofi was introducing this session, it's about African agency in terms of deciding what we actually want to be happening for our continent. So in this regard, we need to start aligning for example, the ideas under the Agenda 2063 for connectivity across the continent, and saying these are the corridors that we want to be established, and this is how we feel that China can come in to help us achieve that. There are many networks that still need help, particularly in Southern Africa. But we're working on getting there. I'm sorry, this is a bit more vague because we haven't gotten into the details of this part of the research, and we've had some data challenges accessing this data. But essentially, that's the idea that we are speaking towards. In terms of ICT, Mr. Kofi gave a great presentation yesterday about the importance of ICT in development across the continent. And for Southern Africa, I guess the most basic level of ICT, development that you can think of is mobile phone subscriptions. And that has, I think, doubled in the last decade or so, if not more. And so that's easy to see how that is useful. But in terms of other forms of ICT development, we're talking about the fact that in order for us to be more efficient in the way that we produce our goods, for us to become more productive and more competitive on the international stage, we need to start taking on innovations that are being developed around the world and adopting them on the African continent so that we are competitive. So that even when China is saying that they are interested in importing more than just raw goods from the African continent, we are able to produce those goods in an effective and competitive manner, internationally competitive manner. And finally, I think, just a couple more slides. Finally, in terms of energy, Mr. Salim spoke about it a little bit, and Mr. Aka will also speak about it in greater detail. But as you can imagine, energy is integral in the industrialization process. In order for you to manufacture, to produce, and industrialize, you need to have reliable levels of energy. So in Zambia, we are currently going through load shedding, which means that power is essentially being rationed throughout the day across various areas of the country. And this means that industries cannot continually produce when and as they need to. And this is obviously disruptive. It reduces the level of production that they can churn out, but also it just inhibits the flow of development in terms of infrastructure, in terms of manufacturing and industrialization. So what we're saying is that China has been a big player on the energy stage on the continent, and we need to find areas of collaboration to make us more efficient in terms of energy production so that we can be more consistent, produce better and more efficient goods, and trade these within the continent and externally. And of course, Mr. Aka will speak in greater detail on this. Okay, so to just wrap up very quickly, what are we talking about? What I was talking about, the CFTA aspires to boost intra-Africa trade and industrialization across the continent. But in order to achieve this, there's a few things which need to be put in place. I've spoken very briefly, I will say, about transport infrastructure, ICT, and energy imperatives that need to be put in place for the CFTA to be successful. And how China comes in here is, yes, they are willing and able to help us with financing in improving these areas, but also, I'll repeat again what the ambassador said, which actually struck me yesterday, that China is not just made of money. They can't just dish out all of the money all the time. So even that's something for me to take home as we finish off this research, we need to think beyond just financing. What other areas of cooperation are there with China that can help boost our productivity as a continent? Okay, I will end there, Shishia, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nakubiana. And can we welcome our next speaker? We'll be talking about energy issues. Thanks, Akabondo.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back, this time with, I think, the technology on my side. Yesterday, I think I was a little bit disappointed because the technology let us down, and we had to run through things, but it's good we have a second chance at redemption. So my presentation is all about, I think, understanding Africa's energy needs, and specifically focusing on the case of Zambia, where we have over the years, I think, tried to institute reforms in the energy sector. As you may be aware, in many African countries and world over, energy plays a very critical role, not only in attainment of health and education, but also for driving businesses, economic development, as well as job creation. So the African scenario, of course, shows us that about 640 million people don't have access to power. Well, we actually have a 40% access rate. So reform, I think, in the power sector in Africa started, I think, with, of course, the typical Bretton Woods institution kind of standard models, of course, which were tied to conditionalities. So many African countries had to reform in the early 90s, I think, to access finance. And these standard reforms, of course, included commercialization of utilities, restructuring national monopoly companies to unbundle, creation of independent regulators, adopting cost-reflective tariffs, as well as opening the sector for private sector investment. But you will notice that most of this reform has been very, very slow for several reasons. We find ourselves, I think, in a landscape where there are major shifts happening in the African economy. We have several initiatives under the Belt and Road Initiative, under FOCAC, attainment of sustainable development goals, and these require, I think, innovative solutions to adapt to these evolving times. So when we look at the case of Zambia, my colleague Salim, I think, had referred to the fact that we are having several challenges in the power sector. And these, of course, have been because of course, a growing population. The size of the economy has grown. And of course, this has placed demands, I think, on the power sector requirements in the country. Looking back at 2015, 2016, when we had severe load shedding, just to demonstrate, I think, the severity of the problem, we experienced about 20% losses in GDP due to power cuts. And we find ourselves in a similar situation where we have deficits due to climate change and some of the other challenges that I've outlined in my presentation. So there is need to begin to look to private sector investment through independent power producers, and how we can get this investment in by creating an enabling environment for investors to come into the country and invest in the power sector. So you also see that independent power producers, of course, offer a sustainable route to increased energy capacity, not only in Zambia, but across sub-Saharan Africa, where public and utility financing has traditionally been the largest source of investment for power generation in many African countries for political reasons and otherwise. So we are faced with significant challenges, I think, as a country in attracting IPPs. And we have tried to look at some of the bottlenecks in an effort to try and unplug some of the problems that we've had. So coming down to the challenges, of course, I've earlier mentioned economic transformation over the last 25 years, I think, has led to an increase in national output, or which has resulted in increased demand, which has outstripped supply. So 2015, 2016, we had poor rainfall. Zambia's power sector capacity relies heavily on hydro, I think sitting at more than 82%, should be 82, 83%, somewhere there. And this underlying problem, I think, is beginning to show its face in the wake of effects of El Nino, as well as climate change. So from our research, we were able firstly to do some demand forecasts, which of course shows us how the demand scenario is likely to look like up until 2033. And we discovered that, of course, using a base case scenario would have power demand double by 2033 and almost triple when you look at the high case scenario. So the other challenge, of course, which is insufficient capacity. Traditionally, demand has always stayed ahead of supply for several reasons. When we look at our generation capacity, we're sitting at around 2,897 megawatts. And then from the capacity that we have, you'll see how overdependence on hydro has really affected the country. So you see, we have hydropower making up 82.76%. We have 10.35% constituting coal, diesel at about 3.06%, and HFO, which is heavy fuel oils, which is at 3.8%, and solar at 0.04%, despite the abundant land as well as sunlight that we enjoy in Africa and Zambia. So part of our problem in Zambia, of course, has been exacerbated by the fact that 3, I think, of the largest hydropower stations that we have sit in the same catchment area. And not only that, including new ones, I think, which have come online, are still sitting in the same watershed area. So when effects of climate change, I think, have hit us, this has significantly impacted our capacity to produce electricity. So we have also noticed a trend in droughts, which I think spans from 1991. We had 2000 and 2014, and the latest one being now. And so when we look at modeling trends in the basin as well, we see that gradually, over time, the water reserves that we have are likely to decline. The potential of Lake Kariba, which is, I think, the world's largest man-made dam, where Zambia produces its power, is likely to fall by a third by 2030. So, despite the imports, I think, that we've made, electricity imports that we made over time, we have not been able to meet demand. I think I've spoken about the losses in GDP, which amounted to 20%. And also, we have a challenge of low access rates for rural areas, which further exacerbate poverty as well as climate change effects, because people in rural areas, as an alternative to energy use, will resort to biomass, which is use of charcoal and other means for them to get their energy. So most of these challenges, of course, are recognized by the country's development plan. And this sets out the pace for what we need to do as a country to get out of the situation. So a very thorny issue, I think, in many African countries has been the issue of cost-reflective tariffs. I have some data, of course, which I'll show you, which I think brings this problem to light. Recently, as recent as, I think, 1st May, the government of the Republic of Zambia had proposed to increase electricity tariffs by 113%. Up until yesterday, when I think a new proposal for 75% has come through. But we have tried also to simulate the impact that this would have on loss of income, on poverty as well. So it demonstrates, I think, the need for many African countries to move towards cost reflectivity. When you look at the table behind, you'll see in green there we have the power utilities companies' proposals to increase electricity tariffs against what has been approved, which is orange. So over the years, I think spanning from 1998, you can see that approvals for increases or migration to cost reflectivity have, encountered challenges. The most recent being this year, when the power utility company had applied to increase tariffs by as much as 113%, which was in turn suspended. So when we simulated the impacts, of course, of this increase, you'll see that low and middle income groups would lose about 12.7% of their income and 7.8% respectively. And then if we combine the cumulative impacts, you would see poor households experiencing 20% reduction in their purchasing power. Looking at the simulated impacts of poverty, of course, we'll see that the proposed increment again would likely push about 165,000 people into poverty. Combine this with the increment, I think, which took place in 2017, you're talking of 240,000 people pushed below the poverty line. Zambia has a population of about 17 million people, so you can imagine the effect of sending about 250,000 people into poverty. So some of the remedies I think that we have proposed for tariff reform, of course, have been that the utility company should reduce its proposed increment of 113% to something lower, and that the price increases must be phased in. Experience has showed us from several African countries that phasing in electricity tariffs achieves a greater chance of success. We've seen this in Kenya. Kenya has had, I think, the best reform example in the electricity sector, where they have unbundled, they have adjusted tariffs to move towards cost reflectivity, and they've done it over a considerable period of time. We're talking 3 to 7, 10 years. And so, given the fiscal constraints that the Zambian government faces, we have proposed that we look to the role of the private sector in investing in electricity in Zambia. The number of potential pipeline projects, I will see from the next table, is immense. We have power sources ranging from solar, thermal, hydropower, with Batoka, I think, which is the largest, with an expected capacity of 2,400 megawatts and a cost of around $2 billion to develop. So we have sufficient pipeline projects. We haven't seen much appetite, of course, from China in investing in hydropower or power in Zambia. Though the Chinese are developing a large hydropower station in Kafue Gorge Lower in Zambia, which is likely to have a capacity of around 750, which should come online, 750 megawatts, which is likely to come online next year. There hasn't been appetite for Chinese investment, to develop hydropower stations or power stations which they can own. And so part of this research, I think, has looked at how we can accelerate investment by learning from comparative experience. We've seen, of course, a great number of companies that are seeking to invest in the electricity sector in Zambia. And we saw this, I think, come to the fore in February 2017 with the launch of the Get Fit solar program, which is a global energy transfer feed-in tariff program, which was oversubscribed in Zambia by a factor of 2. However, the country has relatively low experience, I think, in this area, and there's a lot, I think, to learn from countries that have been successful. And we've reviewed the track record of a number of countries that have tried to get this going, including Uganda, Tanzania, and South Africa, as a way of assessing the situation in Zambia and providing options for reform. So I'll quickly run through, I think, just pick out some of the valuable lessons that we've learned. Of course, experience in a number of African countries shows that effective planning is important for lowering costs for consumers as well as independent power producers. Planning tools, of course, that consider both generation and transmission and identify supply and demand side investments needed to meet projected electricity demand at the least cost over a certain period of time, typically 15 to 20 years, must be utilized. Most, I think, power purchase agreements are around that lifespan. So from our research, we were able to to see that the planning function in the energy sector in Zambia is dispersed and inconsistent. And of course, one of the lessons is that power planning must not be a one-off process. It must be a continuous exercise that keeps up to date with, I think, the latest technologies, costs, and changes in the demand trajectories, as well as security of supply threats, things like load, power cuts and disruptions to supply. We also were able to see that experience suggests that effective planning also involves input from a broad range of stakeholders, which is important for buy-in. When we look at the South Africa case, I think South Africa has tried to move towards renewables. I think this has been resisted by major trade unions, I think for several reasons. The larger component of South Africa's power supply comes from thermal, which is labor intensive. And so having a gradual shift into renewables, such as solar, I think would hurt jobs, and hence the concerns by some of the trade unions. So the other bottleneck has been to do with procurement. We recognize that for planning to play a useful role, it must be translated into appropriate investments and procurement decisions which encompass both public and private sectors. So one common problem that we, I think, discovered in the Zambian scenario is the involvement of more than one actor in the procurement process. The procurement process is so long and it has so many players in the chain such that it takes long, I think, for us to get investment in the sector. I'll quickly run through in the interest of time. Other than planning and procurement, I think the third factor is the credit worthiness of the off-taker. An off-taker is, in many African countries, I think usually state-owned enterprise which buys electricity from independent power producers and sells it to the consumers. In our case, it's ZESCO Limited in Zambia. So in many African countries, we see that most off-takers are in a poor financial state because, of course, the major reason has been because of tariffs being below the cost. And many independent power producers are likely to perceive risk in investing in such countries. So it's important to ensure financial health of the off-taker. From our results, we were able to see that, of course, ZESCO's financial performance is unclear, but it has traditionally borne the expense of below-cost tariffs. I was able to demonstrate the cost of tariffs and show that in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Southern African power pool, Angola has the lowest tariff, and from Angola, Zambia has the lowest tariff. So this, I think, demonstrates, I think, the problem of below-cost tariffs. So we have a situation where we're purchasing power from independent power producers at a higher cost and selling it at a lower cost to consumers, which include residential, as well as the mining sector and industries. And this tends to put fiscal constraints on the government. There's also the issue of having an independent regulator. I was showing you a table where there have been proposals to increase versus the actual approvals, and this presence of an independent regulator, I think, demonstrates the importance for us to have an independent regulator which can allow depoliticizing of the price setting of tariffs. And so most of the issues that we have found in the Zambian situation are cross-cutting. You find this predominantly in most African power utility companies. And just to conclude, of course, we need to build capacity for least cost dynamic power generation and expansion. Power reform in Africa has been slow, and this has slowed the pace of investments. Further reforms are needed. I think we need clarity in roles and responsibilities between utilities and government. Tariffs must be cost reflective. We need to develop common policies and guiding mechanisms among members in the power pool, and we need effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms which can ensure that we can track progress before, during, and after reforms. So to conclude, African countries' reform priorities and programs must focus specific attention on political economic dynamics when designing and executing them, factoring in reasonable understanding of stakeholders, effective communication with the public, and broad-based support in analyzing characteristics of different interest groups is very, very critical for us to achieve success in reforming Africa's power sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Our next speaker will be Shaida Napomba, and she'll share with us some insights.
Thank you very much. Protocol observed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is based on industrialization and infrastructure development, reflecting on Liaoshen Industrial Park. Liaoshen Industrial Park is based in Uganda. Uganda is the pearl of Africa. It picks its name Liao from Liaoning province and Shen from Xinjiang, where the MD of the industrial park comes from. It's a state-to-state initiative that came as a result of the vice governor of Liaoning after he visited Uganda in 2013. They had discussions with His Excellency, the President of Uganda. After that, the President also went to China, and the discussions emanated into the establishment of Liaoshen Industrial Park as it is today. Liaoshen has 14 factories at the moment. 6 are into production already, and 8 are under construction. It's seated on 5.2 square kilometers and growing tremendously. I'm rushing. First, on the left-hand side, that's how the land was underutilized before. It was used for agriculture, less productive. Yes, we did agriculture in this sense, but was it fully utilized? That's the question. Today we have industries being set up, a number of industries producing different products. So from an agricultural setting to an industrial setting, we are growing as a country, we are growing as an industrial park. That is an aerial view of the industrial park. We have an ICD. An ICD is used for clearing and forwarding of all goods that come and leave the industrial park. We have a substation that brings in 132 power, KV line. This will bring about 100 megawatts. And the permanent solution is coming that will bring in 60 megawatts. So in total, we shall have 160 megawatts. Still, that's the aerial view of the industrial park. That is the size of the land where the industrial park is seated. Those are the different factories that we have. They are all aimed towards boosting local content. Most of the factories that we look at or attract, we aim at value addition. We aim at boosting the local content. If a factory is coming on board, we make sure that that factory is going to use the local raw materials, about 75% of the local raw materials. It's going to employ about 70% of the local people. Without that, then the factory is not attracted towards investing in the industrial park. Sorry. That's one of the factories. It's called Huanmu. It uses mangoes and pineapples. They are dried and exported to China. We are adding value to the mangoes. A number of households' income are boosted because there's a value chain from farmer to the production point. We have a number of factories. I won't go through them. But why these factories settled in Uganda, it's because of the conducive environment that attracts investors. We have 100% profit repatriation. Government is willing to allow you take away your profits the way you earn them. Those are some of the factories. We have one that makes tiles. We have one that is going to make fish nets. We have one that will make garments for export to UK and US. We have one that is going to make vegetable oil out of simsim. And remember, Uganda has a good climate. We have the best climate in Africa, I should say. That's why it's called the Pearl of Africa. So that's a substation. There are a number of issues that an investor looks at while he's bringing in money to invest in their country. So yes, we have the labor force. It's young and productive. But when you look at the issue of wages, it's quite key and affects production. So if we want to employ the young generation, let's look at the issue of wages and see that the wages are kept constant, but kept constant and the production process is not affected, so that whatever costs are not trickled down to the final consumer. We have the best raw materials. For example, we have one of our factories using 91% of the local resource raw materials to make tiles. We have the favorable government policies. We have BUBU, Buy Uganda, Build Uganda, that this attracts more investors. One would want to come in a country where the manufacturers are protected. We have a peaceful environment. So why the China-Africa relations? Why the One Belt, One Road initiative? It's key to us as a country. First of all, we are developing countries. Then government need to address a number of issues. If we are to develop, we need China. And China needs us, just as the former speakers said. We need to go into a digital economy. We need to think of issues of digital infrastructure. We need to think of e-commerce. We need to think of e-market. Why would a country like that produces coke, think of exporting coke to Western countries, then it brings back a paste to make confectionery? It's not vital. We usually go ahead and export unfinished products, but here we are. We should attract companies or factories to come in and invest within our countries so that they can use the locally available raw materials. I also looked at the issue of government prioritizing investment in digital infrastructure. This is key, but the environment should also be conducive for what? For investment. We should also look at issues of protecting our consumers. They are really exploited. Therefore, for industrialization to take place, we need this, and that's why we need China. We need technological transfer. In this case, transfer of digital technologies, into brackets, digital infrastructure and platforms for digital financing. We don't have the funds, though we have the resources. Yes, we have the raw materials, we have the skills, but we don't have the transfer. And some of the skills are half-baked. So usually people go on and learn on the job. We need to look at the issue of job creation. This tackles issues of knowledge exchange and skills enhancement. Infrastructure development. My former colleagues were talking about infrastructure financing. We lack a lot. We need funding. It's for this reason that we need countries like China to boost our industrialization. We need to boost our foreign exchange in that whatever monies that could be spent in importing in local goods would now go ahead and be used in what? In providing the public good. If such industries that a country needs, that are key towards the country, are set up within a particular country. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Vuyo. Kwesha. I'm from the University of Witwatersrand and from the Center for Emerging Researchers. My question is basically directed to the energy in Africa.
Can you move the mic a bit next to your mouth?
It's basically directed to the energy in Africa.
Energy in Africa.
Yes. So basically, one of the presenters was talking about the load shedding that is currently happening in Zambia, and most of the recommendation or the suggestion, if I got them very well, was that the private sector must intervene. So I'm interested to know that have they basically exhausted all the capital structure possibilities that they have before they call the private sector? Because at times the issue is not necessarily that we need the finances for the government institution like ESCOM, for example, but we need to address the inefficiencies, and we don't need to have like private investors to come and take over that particular issue.
All right, thanks.
Yes.
Next question or
Thank
comment?
you. Thank you. And my name is Hinak Pepra, and CEO of Pepra and Associates. Just a question and a comment. First question is, I do not understand why, for instance, investment in agriculture is just producers and then raw materials exported. If we look at the supply chain, for instance, if I take a case of cocoa in West Africa, between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, we produce about 60% of the world's cocoa, and what we get out of it, 10% of the total output from cocoa. The confectionery, chocolate industries get the rest. And why is it that when we're talking about agriculture, we're not looking at the supply chain, agro-processing industries that would add value? I know I've noticed the Ugandan experience now, but most of the things that we do, we just export the basic output. We did that in gold, we got virtually nothing out of it. And I believe that the current investment by China should focus more on the supply chain, look at the agro-processing.
Okay.
The second comment, is quick comment, is that I noticed, I looked at a Google search to find who is in our parliaments and who is in our cabinet. And most African governments are dominated by liberal arts people. Very little engineers, and even if I look at the panel here, I think there's not a single engineer. So all that we have is prescription, no solution. When are we really going to change this? Thanks.
Okay, wait. Don't move. Since you're talking about handing back the mic, what is your solution briefly? Not long enough.
Me?
Yes, of course.
We have to change the mix. Get more engineers to sit on a panel, get more engineers to sit in parliament, change the educational profile, give scholarship to those who are studying engineering, and those who want to be priests, they can just go and form the churches. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, our next question or comment. Yes, on the side. You have the microphone. Okay. We'll take a batch of 3 and then ask the panel to answer, and then we'll get another 3 possible.
Okay, my name is Lesecha Malope from City Press. My question is about, it's for the last lady, the last presenter from Uganda.
Yes.
I wanted to know, she mentioned something very disturbing there, that they allow the Chinese to export all their profits. How is that different from being a Chinese colony?
Okay.
Because they own the entire value chain, and they still take all the money with.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's start with the answers. Can I ask Shaida to start, and then we'll move there from.
Thank you very much. This business is business. No one would want to invest into something they are not earning from. This is a law that the government came up with. So long as you fulfill the conditionalities that the government has set up, you're free to take away all your monies, your profits, after you've reaped from your sweat. One, you have to employ 70% of the local people. Two, whatever factory that you're setting up has to use over 75% of the local raw materials. So those are some of the conditionalities that the government came up with. So long as you've fulfilled them and you've made profits, you're free to take away 100% of your profits. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can I ask if any of you wanted to add anything to what Shaida has said? Any of the panelists? If not, we can move to agriculture. Okay, Gideon, and I think Professor Liu, you two have something to add or bring some insight about agriculture, both in Africa and China.
Thank you very much. As we said before, the agriculture sector has lots of challenges in Africa, and one of these challenges is lack of political commitment from the leaders in developing the sectors. Though the sector is pretty much important in overall economic growth as well as contribution of economic development of the country as well as the continent. As I said, smallholder agriculture accounts more than 60%, and in some countries 75%. Our labor is still in agriculture. So in thinking of transforming the economy of Africa, we must start with the agriculture sector. And there is also commitment from CADEP of the African Union to contribute at least 10% of the GDP to the agriculture sector and enhance at least 6% productivity of the sector. But that is not coming up yet. As I said, few countries are doing that, like Ethiopia, Mali, and Niger. So vision for the sector, as well as political commitment, is very much important, which can be expressed by contributing some amount of the GDP to the sector, as well as enhancing the productivity of the sector. Not only that, creating backward and forward linkage with the industry. The agriculture can provide raw materials for the industries. Now, several African countries are embarking on industrialization, but that cannot be achieved if the agriculture sector is not developed well. So that the agriculture sector can provide, the cotton, like the sesame for oil, they can provide input for the industrial sector. As well as the industrial sector can also provide support the agriculture sector through forward linkage, like by producing pesticides or other things which are pertinent to develop the agriculture sector. We have observed last year, we made an assessment on Eastern Industrial Park in Ethiopia, and we have observed that in that industrial park, like around 12 to 13,000 Ethiopians are employed in the industrial park. That means the industrial park created a huge employment opportunity. But there was a great difficulty of discipline of the labor and also efficiency as well as productivity of the labor. We have observed that most of the employees in the park moved from agriculture to industry. So that, discipline of labor was missing. So we suggested to have capacity development for the employees there. So that is one example that if we start with agriculture, the agriculture, not just agriculture per se. We need to also see the ramification of the agriculture sector with the rest of the sectors, like the industry, the service, and others, so that organic linkage can be created. The question why we are still importing raw agriculture product to the world. I think this was because of the colonialism, because of neo-colonialism, that it was designed in such a way that Africa was just providing raw materials to the rest while others were exporting back the processed to Africa, and the value of trade is always negative for Africa. But we need to break such umbilical cord, and it is possible to do so. China has demonstrated that, as Prof. Michian made the presentation, the agriculture sector's productivity increased while the sector's contribution diminished. That is structural transformation. So if we have a vision and a political commitment, it is possible to develop the sector. That is a missing. And why, your second question, why always thinking, prescribing like that? Philosophers has to think, and the politicians, policymaker must act. But such synergy is missing in Africa. Universities are delinked from policymakers. But if you see in China, you know, the politicians are highly advised by the thinkers in the university, so that whatever findings, you know, made in the university must be experimented by policymakers, and such synergy and organic linkage must be established. Thank you.
All right, can I get Professor Liu to add his insights?
First of all, thanks for the questions. Agriculture is really, you could say, it's the mother sector of all other sectors. Every country, every economy starts with agriculture. There are short-term and long-term challenges. In the short term, I think there is one economist, a great economist, Worthiness. He coined this 4 contributions from agriculture in the process of industrialization. One is the product contribution, the factor contribution, the market contribution, and the foreign exchange contribution. In the short term, indeed, agriculture, if you are going to industrialize, and I think for any economy of a significant size, unless you are city-state, that's a different story. If your economy and population is of a significant size, then industrialization is the process which you will have to go through. And at the initial stages of industrialization, agriculture will have to contribute, specifically in those 4 areas, as listed by Worthiness. China did that. Before, one could argue that before 78, agriculture in China played exactly those roles, making product contribution, factor contribution, market contribution, and the foreign exchange contribution. But after that, when you are into industrialization process, it's also very important to think about the long-term challenges. And I think the most important long-term issue is, would you want your agriculture to be large-scale farming into the future, like in what's happening in America, in Australia, in Canada? Or would you think it's much more realistic and much better to have an agriculture of smallholder farming, as in Japan? And in many respects, China is learning from Japan. Smallholder farming. In Japan, the smallholder farming initially is very small indeed, but now it's beginning to become larger. But even so, it's the typical Japanese family farm is just around 2 hectares. In China is around half hectare at the moment. I'm sure over the process, the typical family size will become larger. But it's very important, even at the very beginning, for governments, for researchers, for policy makers to think through these issues. Do you want in the, say, 100, 200 years later to have a system of agriculture like the large-scale farming in America? Is it realistic? And what would be the process to achieve that? Or is it much better and more realistic to have a system, continue to have a system of smallholder farming, even though the typical family size might in the process become larger and larger, but not to the extent of large-scale farming in Canada, America, Australia, because we say in terms of land resources, we simply don't have that much land resource. So it's very important. And may I also just say a point about another question. which is in China actually we bash the engineers, we bash against the engineers because why is it that why is it that our leaders all tend to be engineers? No, that's the sort of people that, yeah. But I suppose really the best leadership would be a multidisciplinary. So it should be not just multidisciplinary, probably cross-disciplinary. Scientists, engineers, and social scientists, liberal arts people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also, why they're all men. Sorry for that. But anyway, can I hand it over to Akabondo to probably very briefly touch on the energy issue. And when we get a chance, if there's a little bit more time, I would like to ask also Nakubiana and then Salim to add maybe a few things before we close this session.
Yes, I think the question was centered around why can't the government invest in the power sector as opposed to looking to the private sector. When you look at the power sector in most African countries, it's largely dominated by state-owned enterprises, governments. And what this does is, in the long run, you've seen inefficiencies develop. I think these are born out of the fact that state-owned enterprises are generally inefficient. They tend to be political. And also, this means governments have to bear the burden of subsidizing power to residential consumers, to industry, and the list is endless of consumers. So in a situation where a government is constrained in terms of resources, the prudent thing to do is to begin to look to the private sector to invest, because then what it means is you have no money to pump into the power sector. At the moment, in Zambia, more than 80% of power that is generated is run by the state-owned company. And so when you have fiscal constraints, to reduce the burden on the treasury, you have to attract private sector investment. But for this investment to also come in, you need to set the right regulatory framework. Work on your laws, work on the guidelines, work on regulation. Ensure that your off-taker that's buying power from the independent power producers is in great financial shape. So you'll be able to meet your power demands without having to fork out resources, or without having to burden taxpayers. Because when you have to make these investments, it means you have to borrow money, and then taxpayers pay that cost. But if investors are willing to come in and set up private businesses, it takes the burden off you, and then also it has a win-win situation, because then you are able to provide sufficient power to drive your industry and your economic development agenda. So it's a prudent thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask the other two? We can start with perhaps her, and then we'll end it over with Salim. So Nakubiana, perhaps you can tease out what's the best takeaway we could take with that, at least your audience can take away when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and of course the link with China and what it means for everything that deals with cooperation.
Okay, thank you. I think the biggest takeaway as regards the AFCFTA would be the fact that everyone is, whether they say it or not, a little skeptical about whether it will work or not. But in just talking to some of the delegates here, I think we need to appreciate the fact that even though even though it may take a long time to get there, the point is that we are making steps towards it. So whatever sort of progress you end up making brings you closer to integration, brings you closer to increased intra-Africa trade, brings you closer to boosting your industrialization. There's a big issue in terms of boosting regional integration because of the fact that there's no sort of authoritative body which can dare I say, dictate to the countries how to behave, what they need to do in order to make things work. Each country is operating as a sovereign state. Each country will make the decisions that they feel are best for their country. They may not always align with the broader initiatives that are trying to be put in place for the whole continent. But we need to find a way to break down those barriers, to start committing to some of these things. Yes, we need to look out for our individual countries, but also for the greater good. Sorry, I just turned that off. For the greater good as a continent. If you look at the European Union, yes, you know, we've got things like Brexit and everybody's trying to pull out of it now, but they have achieved so much in the time that they have been a cohesive union, and that is something that we should be able to aspire to. I think that's pretty much all I'll say on that. Thank you.
So in short, what you're saying, that the benefits are greater than the challenges we seem to be facing now.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Great, thank you very much. Salim? Salim, I was quite curious to see that, well, I would have wanted to hear a little bit more about blue capital as part of the blue economy and what could be the size of this kind of investment going across. But I know we don't have enough time. Mm-hmm. Just give us your takeaway. Perhaps we can discuss the rest later.
Thank you so much. I think we'll talk about that probably over lunch. But I'm tempted to sort of react to a comment that came of engineers and other fields. I think we must understand that the development agenda, in a nutshell, is a process. It begins with the politicians, whether we like it or not. The leaders will gather at the AU, they'll gather at FOCAC, they'll gather wherever. That's where these decisions are made. It's not the engineers per se who sit there, but that's where the course of action is actually agreed upon. From there, then it comes down to probably ministers, to technocrats, to social scientists who actually have to actualize what has been agreed. Without that framework, without that enabling environment, even if we have those skills, they would have a limit. So I think I would appreciate the fact that it is probably a cycle that needs all disciplines at the end of the day. And we have to be alive to the fact that in Africa, we all know the different levels of skills that we have, different levels of education that we have. So we have to work within what we have. But I think more so importantly is to have a rich mix of social scientists, of the technocrats, of the engineers, so that ultimately we're able to work towards an agenda that we want to actually work on. And also I think another important aspect is conversations that we've had, for example, with China-Africa relations. So when China calls on African leaders for the FOCAC, China would have an agenda of everything that actually needs to be deliberated. Whereas for the African leaders, usually when the call is made, we all go, the 53 of us, probably without a common agenda for each and every one of us. We go with our individual agendas to the FOCAC. At the end of the day, when we come back with deliberations, almost each and every one of us wants to have a particular deal for ourselves and our country. And that, to some extent, is frustrating African development, because if we go under the confines of maybe even 4 key themes that we want from China, that way it would be better, whereby even as we're having deliberations, we all know that perhaps, I know it's not that easy, but it can be done. But if we have that agenda as we go to interact with China, I think that would actually help Africa much more than what is happening currently, where all the 53, 52 nations have different agendas. At the end of the day, we go to the next FOCAC, it will be the same thing that happens. So I think more so it's just a call for regional integration to really be put into perspective. We've talked about this, I think, for a lot of years, but I think the CFTA probably provides hope, because more than ever, I think African leaders now are seeing the need of working towards a common goal, from trade to developing the continent as a whole. I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please give them a good hand of applause. And I want to thank our panelists and also you for asking those questions. And can I ask you to probably join your seat on the other side for the next session? Thank you again. Please give them another hand of applause.